The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows as Emily Carter lay in her hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly above her, casting a sterile glow over the white sheets and lifeless walls. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was the only sound breaking the silence, but it felt irrelevant. Nothing mattered anymore. She tried to move her legs, willing them to shift or twitch in any way, but there was nothing, just emptiness. A lump formed in her throat as she clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms. Just a week ago, she had been running across the track, feeling the wind rush through her hair, the crowd cheering her on. She had been invincible. But now, she was broken. The accident had taken everything, her freedom, her future, her very sense of self. The door creaked open, and her father, Jack, stepped in. His presence filled the room, but there was something different in his eyes, a sadness he tried to mask behind a tired smile. "Hey, kiddo," he said, pulling a chair beside her bed. "How are you feeling?" Emily scoffed and turned her gaze back to the ceiling. "Like a champion," she muttered bitterly. Jack sighed and rubbed his hands together nervously. "The doctors say it's still early," he said. "There's hope, Em. We'll get through this." "Hope?" Emily laughed hollowly. "Dad, I can't even move my legs. What's left to fight for?" Jack didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gently took her hand in his and squeezed it. "You," he said softly. "You're still here. That's enough for me." Emily wanted to believe him, wanted to hold on to something. But the weight of her new reality pressed too hard. The doctors had said her spinal damage was severe, and while there was a chance of improvement with therapy, maybe wasn't enough. Maybe didn't promise anything. Jack stayed by her side for hours, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about the firehouse, the stray cat that had wandered in, and the rookie firefighter who had nearly triggered the sprinklers. He was trying so hard to keep her engaged, but Emily barely responded. She was too drained to care. Later that night, when the hospital was quiet, Emily lay awake in the darkness. She wasn't ready to face tomorrow. She wasn't ready to accept that this emptiness was her new life. Jack, sitting in the chair beside her, had fallen asleep, his head resting against the wall. His strong shoulders seemed weighed down by something unspoken. Emily hated seeing him like this, hated that she was the cause of his pain. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. Crying wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't bring her old life back. She closed her eyes, trying to remember the feeling of running, the wind against her skin, her legs carrying her forward. But it felt so far away, like a dream she couldn't grasp. The next morning, the hospital came to life again. Nurses checked her vitals, offering reassurances that felt rehearsed. Emily barely spoke, every day blending into one long cycle of emptiness. Jack never left her side, never allowing the silence to settle for too long. But no matter how hard he tried, she was slipping away, retreating into herself where nothing could reach her. Then came the day of her first therapy session. Emily barely acknowledged the wheelchair waiting by her bed. When the nurse wheeled her into the rehab center, her stomach twisted with dread. The room smelled of antiseptic and rubber mats. There were others there, all fighting to reclaim what they had lost, stretching or lifting weights. Emily wanted to scream. She didn't belong here. Dr. Harrison, her neurologist, greeted her with a kind but assessing gaze. "Emily, we're going to take things slow today," he said. "No pressure, just getting familiar with movement again." Movement. What a cruel joke. The session was a disaster. Emily couldn't feel anything, couldn't make her legs respond. Every attempt was met with failure. Every failure dug the knife in deeper. She could see the way Jack was watching, his face careful, supportive. But she knew. She knew he was afraid too. The frustration boiled over. "I can't do this," she snapped, shoving the therapist's hand away. "Just stop." Dr. Harrison didn't flinch, but he didn't push either. He simply nodded and signaled for a break. Jack stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, but Emily pulled away. "I'm done," she whispered, voice shaking. "I'm done trying." Jack crouched beside her, his jaw tight. "You don't get to quit, Emily," he said, his voice raw. "You're my daughter. You're the toughest person I know." Emily's throat burned, but she shook her head. Not anymore. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. That night, back in her hospital room, Emily stared at her reflection in the window. She barely recognized the girl looking back at her. She wasn't Emily Carter, the fastest runner on the track team. She wasn't Emily Carter, the girl who loved the rush of the wind, the thrill of competition. She was someone else now, someone who didn't know how to move forward. And for the first time, she truly wondered, was there anything left of her to save? What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that her life was about to change again. But this time, it wouldn't be tragedy that broke her world apart. It would be something else entirely. Something with bright blue eyes, something with 4 legs, and something that, against all logic, would make her believe in miracles again. The days blurred into a monotony that Emily couldn't escape. Every morning felt the same, waking up to the sterile scent of antiseptic, the dull hum of hospital machines, and the distant chatter of nurses making their rounds. She had stopped checking her phone, stopped asking about the outside world. What was the point? That world no longer felt like hers. She wasn't the same Emily who had sprinted across the track, who had felt invincible with every beat of her racing heart. That version of her was gone, replaced by someone she barely recognized, someone who was stuck in a body that refused to move, in a life that had lost its purpose. Jack never stopped trying. He visited every day, bringing books she never read, stories she barely listened to, memories he hoped would spark something inside her. He tried to be strong for her, but she saw through it. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged just a little more each time she pushed him away. And yet, he never gave up. "You don't have to be okay today, Em," he would say, his voice quiet but steady. "But I need you to keep showing up." She didn't respond anymore. Silence had become easier than fighting. 3 weeks after the accident, Emily was discharged from the hospital. She should have felt something, relief maybe, but all she felt was emptiness as Jack wheeled her through the hospital doors into the outside world. The sun was too bright, the air too fresh, as if everything had moved on without her. The drive home was quiet. Jack tried to make conversation, but she barely responded. The car hummed along the highway, passing familiar places that now felt foreign. The coffee shop she used to stop by after practice. The park where she had spent countless summer afternoons with friends. The track field, her track field. She turned her head away, staring blankly at the passing scenery, wishing she could disappear into it. The house felt different. It was the same place she had lived her whole life, yet stepping, or rather being wheeled through the door, made her feel like a stranger. Jack had made adjustments. Ramps at the entrances, handrails in the bathroom, even a motorized wheelchair waiting for her in the living room. "I had them install everything last week," he said, trying to sound casual. "You can get around easier now." Emily didn't answer. She hated how much effort had gone into making this house fit her new reality. Hated how Jack had spent nights planning for a life she wanted no part of. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling. The quiet of home was different from the hospital, less clinical, more personal, yet just as suffocating. The memories in this room were a cruel reminder of what she had lost. Her running medals still hung on the wall, mocking her. The sneakers she once laced up with excitement sat untouched in the corner. Her whole life was still here, but she wasn't. The next morning, Jack surprised her. "Come on," he said, standing by the door with his car keys. "We're going for a ride." Emily frowned. I don't feel like going anywhere. Jack didn't budge. I didn't ask if you felt like it. There was something different in his voice today, firmer, more determined. She reluctantly let him wheel her to the car, annoyed at how effortlessly he lifted her into the passenger seat. The drive was quiet, but Jack's grip on the wheel was tense, as if he was holding back from saying something. After about 20 minutes, they pulled into an unfamiliar parking lot. A large sign read, Bright Futures Animal Rescue. Emily's brow furrowed. Are you getting a dog? She asked, her tone flat. Jack shook his head. We're getting you a dog. Emily let out a humorless laugh. You think a dog is going to fix this? Jack exhaled slowly, gripping the steering wheel. Number? But I think maybe it can help. She wanted to argue, to tell him this was ridiculous, but she didn't have the energy. Inside, the shelter was a mix of chaos and warmth. The sound of barking filled the air, tails wagging from behind metal kennels, hopeful eyes peering up at every passerby. A woman with a kind smile greeted them. You must be Jack and Emily. I'm Rachel, the rescue coordinator. We've got a few wonderful dogs I think you might connect with. Emily bit the inside of her cheek, already regretting agreeing to this. Rachel led them past rows of kennels, pausing in front of a separate enclosure. This one, she said, gesturing toward a sleek, silver-coated husky curled up in the corner. Her name is Luna. She's been with us for a while. Never quite found the right home. Emily barely looked at the dog. She didn't want a pet. She wanted her life back. Jack crouched beside the enclosure. Hey, girl, he said softly. At the sound of his voice, the husky lifted her head. Emily expected her to bark, to wag her tail like the other dogs, but Luna just stared. Her eyes, icy blue and unnervingly intelligent, locked onto Emily. There was something almost unsettling about them, as if the dog could see right through her. Rachel opened the gate and Luna padded forward cautiously, stopping just inches away from Emily's wheelchair. The dog didn't jump, didn't beg for attention. Instead, she sat down, staring up at Emily with quiet patience. Something in the air shifted. For the first time in weeks, Emily felt something other than numbness. She wasn't sure what it was. Curiosity, maybe. Or something deeper. Something she couldn't quite name. Luna didn't look at her with pity, didn't see the broken girl in the wheelchair. She just saw her. Jack watched the interaction, hope flickering in his eyes. She's yours if you want her, he said. Emily hesitated. She wanted to say no, wanted to tell him this was pointless. But as she looked into Luna's unwavering gaze, something inside her whispered, maybe. Luna was silent the whole ride home, curled up in the back seat, content as if she had already decided this was where she belonged. Jack kept glancing at Emily, waiting for her to say something, but she remained quiet. She didn't know how she felt about this, didn't know why she had agreed, but as they pulled into the driveway, she found herself stealing one last glance at Luna. Later that night, Emily lay in bed, staring at the ceiling like always. The house was quiet. The world was still heavy. But then, the soft padding of paws echoed through the hallway. Luna entered the room without hesitation, stepping lightly across the floor before stopping beside Emily's bed. She didn't make a sound, just sat there, watching, and for the first time in weeks, Emily didn't feel so alone. The first few days with Luna were quiet. The husky never barked, never whined, never demanded attention the way Emily had expected. Instead, Luna simply existed in her space, as if waiting for something, waiting for Emily to acknowledge her, to let her in. But Emily wasn't ready. She barely acknowledged the dog, barely looked at her. She had no interest in forming a bond with an animal when she could barely stand the thought of her own existence. Yet, no matter how much she ignored her, Luna never left her side. One afternoon, Emily sat by the window, watching the world move on without her. Kids were riding bikes down the street, neighbors walking their dogs, cars rolling past as if nothing had changed. She gritted her teeth, gripping the arms of her wheelchair as frustration burned in her chest. Nothing had changed for them. But for her, everything was different. She had lost herself, and no one seemed to notice, except Luna. The husky sat on the floor beside her, those piercing blue eyes fixed on her, reading her like an open book. Emily exhaled sharply. "You don't get it," she muttered. "You're just a dog." Luna didn't move, didn't react. She simply tilted her head slightly, as if considering Emily's words. Then, slowly, she stood and placed a single paw on Emily's lap. A strange sensation rushed through Emily's body. Not pain, not numbness, but something else entirely. A warmth, a presence, a flicker of something she hadn't felt in weeks. She inhaled sharply, instinctively jerking back. The sensation faded as soon as Luna pulled away. Emily stared at her, heart pounding. "What was that?" she whispered, almost afraid to speak the words aloud. She tested the feeling again the next day. Luna sat beside her as usual, patient as ever, waiting. Tentatively, Emily reached out, brushing her fingers over the husky's thick fur. The moment they connected, the warmth returned, not just physically, but deep within her, like a pulse, like a heartbeat that had been missing. Her chest tightened. Was she imagining this? Was it all in her head? Jack noticed it too. He had spent weeks watching Emily retreat further into herself, but something had shifted. It was subtle at first. Small things, like the way she rested her hand on Luna's back absent-mindedly, or how she no longer turned away when the husky sat beside her. Jack didn't push, didn't ask, just observed, letting whatever was happening unfold naturally. But then, something undeniable happened. It was late one evening when Jack found Emily asleep in her chair by the window, Luna curled up at her feet. He was about to wake her when he noticed something. Emily's foot had moved. It was slight, almost imperceptible, just the barest twitch beneath the blanket. But it was there. His breath caught in his throat. Had he imagined it? He crouched down, watching intently. A few seconds later, it happened again. A small, involuntary movement. Jack swallowed hard, his mind racing. The next morning, Jack hesitated before saying anything, afraid of giving Emily false hope. But when he walked into the kitchen, he found her sitting at the table, looking different. There was something in her eyes, something he hadn't seen in weeks. "Something's happening," she said softly, running her fingers through Luna's fur. "I don't know how to explain it, but when she's near me, I feel something, not just in my head, in my legs." Jack's pulse quickened. "Em, are you serious?" She nodded slowly, uncertainty flickering across her face. "I thought I was imagining it at first, but it's real. I know it is." Jack inhaled deeply, steadying himself. He had spent so much time holding on to hope, clinging to the possibility that Emily could recover. Now, for the first time, it felt within reach. "Then we need to test it," he said, his voice calm but firm. Later that day, Jack took Emily to see Dr. Harrison. The neurologist greeted them with his usual calm demeanor, but raised a curious brow at the sight of Luna accompanying them. "What's this?" he asked, nodding toward the husky. Emily hesitated, then exhaled. "She's part of the reason we're here." Jack filled him in quickly, explaining what they had seen, what Emily had felt. Dr. Harrison listened carefully, his expression unreadable. "I'll be honest," he said finally. "This isn't something I've come across before. But let's see what we can find out." The tests began as they always did. Dr. Harrison checking Emily's reflexes, monitoring any sign of movement. At first, everything was the same. No response, no sign of improvement. But then he asked Jack to bring Luna closer. As soon as the husky pressed her head against Emily's leg, something changed. Dr. Harrison's eyes widened slightly as he saw it. A reaction. Faint, but real. "Emily," he said carefully, "tell me exactly what you're feeling." Emily swallowed hard, focusing. "It's like a vibration, a tingling, right where she's touching." Dr. Harrison leaned back, deep in thought. "I've seen cases where emotional support animals improve a patient's mental health, but this is different." He looked at Emily seriously. "I can't explain it, but I don't think we should ignore it either." The drive home was quiet. Emily was lost in thought, her fingers absently combing through Luna's fur. She wasn't imagining it. This was real, and if it was real, then what did it mean? Could she actually get better? Could she, against all odds, walk again? Jack glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "What are you thinking?" he asked finally. Emily inhaled sharply. "I think—" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I think Luna is more than just a dog." Jack didn't respond right away. He had always believed in science, in things that could be explained. But this was something else, and for the first time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, Luna had come into their lives for a reason greater than any of them understood. That night, Emily lay awake in bed, Luna curled up beside her. The husky's breathing was slow and steady, a calming presence in the darkness. Emily reached down, resting a hand on Luna's back. The warmth was there again, steady and reassuring. She closed her eyes. For weeks, she had convinced herself that she had lost everything, that she would never move forward, never be whole again. But now, for the first time, something deep inside her whispered a different story. She wasn't broken. She wasn't done. And maybe, just maybe, this was only the beginning. The days that followed were unlike anything Emily had experienced since the accident. For the first time in weeks, she felt something stirring inside her, something fragile but undeniable. Hope. It wasn't loud or overwhelming, but it was there, quietly growing with every touch, every interaction she had with Luna. She couldn't explain it, didn't know if she even wanted to, but deep down, a part of her clung to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as lost as she had believed. Jack noticed the change immediately. It wasn't just in the way she carried herself, but in the way she looked at Luna, the way she absent-mindedly rested her fingers in the husky's fur as if drawing strength from her presence. He didn't say anything at first, didn't want to break the delicate balance that was forming between them, but he knew that something was shifting. He saw it in the way Emily started paying attention again, to her surroundings, to herself, to the small, fleeting moments of warmth that Luna seemed to bring out of her. One morning, as Emily sat on the porch watching Luna chase a squirrel through the backyard, she took a deep breath, steadying herself before speaking. "I want to try." Jack, who had been sipping his coffee nearby, lowered his cup slowly. "Try what?" She hesitated for only a second. "Walking." The word felt foreign, almost dangerous, as if saying it out loud would make it impossible. But she had to say it. She had to claim it. Jack's grip on his mug tightened. He wanted this more than anything for her, but he also knew the weight of disappointment, the sting of false hope. "Emily," he said carefully, "this won't be easy." She met his gaze, something resolute behind her eyes. "I know." That was all it took. Later that day, Jack cleared a space in the living room, setting up the parallel bars the physical therapist had left behind weeks ago. Emily had refused to use them before, but now, as she wheeled herself closer, there was a different energy in the air. She reached out, gripping the cool metal in her hands. Luna sat nearby, watching, ears perked, tail still. Emily could feel her presence, steady and unwavering, like an anchor. Jack stood beside her, hands hovering just in case, but he didn't touch her. He knew she needed to do this on her own. Emily inhaled sharply and pulled. Her arms trembled, muscles unused to bearing her weight after weeks of stillness, but she didn't stop. Her body screamed in protest, every fiber of her being begging her to sit back down, but she ignored it. Then, slowly, painfully, she shifted her weight forward. Her right foot moved. It was small, barely a shuffle, but it was real. She gasped, gripping the bars tighter as her left foot followed. The sensation was foreign, unsteady, like learning to walk all over again, but it was happening. Jack's eyes widened, his breath caught in his throat, but he didn't dare move, didn't dare interrupt. Then Luna did something unexpected. She stood up, walked forward, and pressed her head gently against Emily's leg. A warmth spread through her body, different from anything she had ever felt. Stronger, more intense. It was like an unspoken push, a silent encouragement. Emily took another step, then another. A sob built in Jack's chest, but he swallowed it down, forcing himself to stay steady. "You're doing it," he whispered, barely able to believe it himself. Emily's breath was shaky, her arms burning from the effort, but she was standing, moving. After everything, after all the pain, all the nights spent believing she would never walk again, she was here, step by step, inch by inch. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, her legs buckled. Jack lunged forward, catching her before she hit the ground. Luna let out a sharp bark, her blue eyes darting between them. Emily's breathing was ragged, her hands trembling as she clung to Jack's arm. Tears burned in her eyes, frustration clawing at her throat. I thought I could..." Jack squeezed her shoulder, his voice firm but gentle. "You did, Em. You did." She looked up at him, her expression torn between triumph and defeat. "But I barely..." "You moved," he cut her off. "That's more than you could do yesterday. And tomorrow, it'll be more." She let out a breath, shaky but determined. Jack could see the battle happening inside her, the war between doubt and hope. He wasn't going to let the doubt win. That night, Emily sat on the edge of her bed, staring down at her legs. Luna rested her head on her lap, eyes half closed but alert. Emily ran a hand through her fur, grounding herself in the steady rhythm of the husky's breathing. "You knew, didn't you?" she murmured. Luna's tail thumped once against the floor. Emily didn't know how or why, but she was certain of one thing. Luna wasn't just a dog. She was something more, something she couldn't quite put into words yet. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid to find out. The next morning, she was up before Jack. When he walked into the living room, still groggy with sleep, he found Emily already at the parallel bars, her hands gripping the metal, determination burning in her eyes. Luna sat beside her like always. Jack blinked in surprise. "You're up early?" Emily turned her head, breathless but smiling. "Yeah," she said. "I have work to do." The next few weeks were grueling. Every morning Emily pushed herself harder, determined to reclaim what she had lost. The pain was unbearable at times, her muscles weak from months of inactivity, but she refused to stop. Each step, no matter how small, felt like a battle against her own body. Jack was always there, watching, encouraging, sometimes catching her when she lost balance. But Luna was something else. The husky didn't just watch, she anticipated. She moved when Emily moved, adjusting, pressing her body against Emily's legs just enough to give her something to lean on, but never too much. She was like a silent guide, her presence the only thing keeping Emily steady when her own strength failed. At first, Emily thought it was just instinct, the way service dogs were trained to assist people. But the more time passed, the more she realized Luna wasn't just reacting, she was predicting. When Emily felt herself about to falter, Luna was already there. When frustration boiled over and she was seconds away from breaking down, Luna would nudge her hand, her icy blue eyes locked onto Emily's as if reminding her to breathe. It was almost eerie, how deeply connected they seemed. But Emily didn't question it. She couldn't afford to. The day she took her first steps without the parallel bars, Jack nearly dropped his coffee. He had turned away for only a moment, flipping through the newspaper when he heard Luna's soft whine. He looked up to see Emily standing. No support, no rails, just her and Luna, standing side by side. His heart nearly stopped. "Emily?" She exhaled shakily, adjusting her stance, her fingers twitching as if fighting the urge to grab onto something. "I think I can do it," she whispered. Jack could barely breathe. "Then do it." Luna stepped forward, slow and measured, never breaking eye contact with Emily. And then Emily moved, one foot in front of the other, one slow, controlled step, then another. She wobbled, her breath catching in her throat, but Luna was there, shifting her weight ever so slightly against Emily's leg, balancing her just enough without taking away the effort. Another step, and another. Jack felt something tighten in his chest. He wanted to celebrate, to cheer, to run to her, but he didn't. He knew this moment belonged to her. So he just stood there, watching as his daughter, who had once believed she would never walk again, took step after step across the living room floor. By the time she reached the couch, Emily collapsed onto it, laughing and crying at the same time. Luna immediately jumped up beside her, licking her face with frantic enthusiasm, her tail wagging so hard her whole body shook. Jack finally let out the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He wiped his eyes quickly before walking over, kneeling in front of Emily. "You did it," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Emily let out a breathless laugh, her hands still shaking. "I did." She turned her head to look at Luna, brushing her fingers through the husky's thick fur. "She knew I could." That night, as the excitement settled into a quiet sense of triumph, Emily found herself staring at the ceiling, lost in thought. She had walked. It still didn't feel real. Every moment since the accident had been clouded by doubt, by fear, by the belief that her life was over before it had even begun. But today had changed everything. Still, there was something nagging at her, something she couldn't shake. Luna was more than just a companion. That much was obvious. But how? How had she known? How had she been so precise, so aware? Emily had read about therapy dogs before, but this was different. Luna wasn't just offering comfort. She was guiding her in ways no one else had been able to, and Emily needed to know why. The next morning, she made a decision. "I want to know where she came from," she told Jack over breakfast. He raised an eyebrow. "The shelter said she was a rescue." "I know," Emily said, pushing her eggs around her plate. "But there has to be more to it. She's different." Jack studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay, let's find out." They drove back to the shelter that afternoon, Luna sitting between them in the truck, her head resting on Emily's lap. When they arrived, the woman at the front desk recognized them immediately. "Well, look who it is," she said, smiling down at Luna. "How's she settling in?" Emily hesitated, glancing at Jack before answering. "She's incredible. But we were wondering if you had any more information about her history." The woman's smile faded slightly. "Luna's a bit of a mystery, to be honest." She reached for a file on the desk, flipping through the pages. She was found wandering near a rehabilitation center on the outskirts of town. No tags, no chip. The staff there swore she wasn't theirs, but what's strange is that she kept gravitating toward the patients. Emily's fingers curled around the edge of the desk. "What do you mean?" The woman shrugged. "They said she had this way of sensing things. She'd go straight to the patients who were struggling the most, even the ones who weren't visibly in pain. And somehow they always felt better after being around her. They tried to keep her, but she refused to stay. One day she just disappeared. Jack exchanged a glance with Emily. The pieces were starting to fit together, but it still didn't make sense. So no one knows where she came from? The woman shook her head. No records, no owners. She just showed up one day and seemed to know exactly where she was needed. Emily looked down at Luna, who was sitting patiently by her feet, her blue eyes steady, unreadable. Somehow, deep down, Emily wasn't surprised. She didn't understand it, but she knew. Luna had chosen her, just like she had chosen those patients before. On the way home, Emily couldn't stop thinking about it. She ran her fingers through Luna's fur absent-mindedly, feeling the steady rise and fall of her breathing. "What are you?" she murmured under her breath. Luna didn't react, just continued staring out the window as if she already knew the answer. That night, Emily had a dream. She was standing, not in the living room, not at the parallel bars, but on the track. The same track she had once called home. The sky above her was endless, the air thick with the scent of rain. She could hear the distant murmur of a crowd, feel the pulse of anticipation in her chest. And beside her, Luna sat, watching. Emily looked down at her own feet. She wasn't in a wheelchair. She wasn't struggling to stand. She was strong, whole, ready. Then, Luna nudged her forward. Emily took a deep breath and ran. The following weeks were a blur of progress and determination. Emily pushed herself harder than ever, her body aching but her spirit stronger than it had been in months. Every step felt like a small victory, a reclamation of the life she had thought was lost forever. Luna was always there, her steady presence anchoring Emily when doubt threatened to pull her back into the darkness. Jack watched it all unfold with cautious optimism, afraid to let his hopes rise too high, but unable to deny what he was seeing. His daughter was coming back to life. One evening, as Emily stood by the porch railing, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she found herself reflecting on how far she had come. The girl who had once refused to get out of bed, who had been convinced her future had been stolen from her, was now standing, walking, fighting. Luna sat beside her, tail flicking lazily, as if sensing Emily's thoughts. "I never thought I'd make it here," Emily murmured, running a hand absently through the husky's thick fur. "Not after everything." Jack, who had been leaning against the doorway, stepped forward. "You didn't just make it here," he said quietly. "You fought for it. You earned it." Emily let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "I wouldn't have done it alone." She glanced down at Luna, whose blue eyes met hers with a quiet understanding. "She knew before I did. She never gave up on me." Jack nodded, his gaze full of something unreadable. Sometimes the ones who save us aren't the ones we expect. The next morning, Emily woke up with a strange sense of anticipation. Something felt different. It wasn't just the progress she had made or the fact that walking no longer seemed like an impossible dream. It was something deeper, something pulling at her from within. She glanced at Luna, who was already awake, staring at her with that knowing look she had come to recognize. "What?" Emily asked with a smirk. "You planning something?" Luna thumped her tail once, then stood, stretching before padding toward the door. An idea formed in Emily's mind, a wild, impossible thought that she couldn't shake. "Dad," she said over breakfast, pushing her plate aside, "I want to try something." Jack raised an eyebrow, waiting. "I want to go to the track." Silence filled the room. Jack's expression was unreadable, but Emily could see the hesitation in his eyes. She understood why. The track had been her entire world before the accident. It was where she had felt most alive, most free, and it was also the place that had felt the most out of reach since the moment she lost the ability to run. Jack set his coffee down, exhaling slowly. Are you sure? Emily nodded. I need to. An hour later, they pulled into the parking lot of the local track. The sight of it sent a jolt of something bittersweet through Emily's chest. She hadn't been here since before the accident. Everything looked the same. The lanes stretching out endlessly, the stands standing empty, waiting for the next race. But she wasn't the same. Jack wheeled her to the edge of the track, but Emily didn't stay in the chair for long. She gripped the armrests, took a deep breath, and pushed herself up. Luna was instantly at her side, pressing her body against Emily's leg, steadying her. The husky's presence was as unwavering as ever. For a long moment, Emily just stood there staring at the lanes ahead of her. The memories came rushing back, of races won and lost, of the exhilaration of crossing the finish line, of the feeling of being unstoppable. She had believed she would never feel that again. But now, standing here, with Luna by her side, she wasn't so sure. Jack stepped up beside her, his voice gentle. You don't have to do this. Emily looked at him, her eyes clear. I do. She took her first step onto the track. The surface beneath her feet felt foreign and familiar all at once. Another step, then another. Luna moved with her, perfectly in sync, as if they had been training for this moment all along. Emily focused on her breathing, on the rhythm of her steps, on the way her body felt, not weak, not broken, but capable. And then, something incredible happened. Luna nudged her forward, just slightly, just enough. Emily's foot hit the ground, and suddenly, she wasn't walking anymore. She was running. It wasn't fast. It wasn't graceful, but it was real. Her legs, her body, her spirit. They all remembered. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He watched, frozen, as his daughter, his strong, determined, unstoppable daughter, moved down the track, Luna right beside her, a perfect, silent partner in her victory. Emily didn't stop until she reached the far end of the track. Her chest was heaving, her legs burning, but she was smiling, laughing through the tears streaming down her face. Luna barked excitedly, circling her, celebrating in the only way she knew how. Jack jogged to her, his own eyes shining. Emily! He couldn't even find the words. She turned to him, breathless but radiant. I told you I'd do it. Jack let out a shaky laugh, shaking his head. Yeah, you did. As they stood there, the sun beginning to set behind them, Emily realized something. The accident had changed her, yes. It had taken something from her, but it had also given her something unexpected. It had shown her resilience she never knew she had. It had brought her closer to her father. And it had led her to Luna. Life wasn't about the things you lost. It was about what you did with what was left. She reached down, scratching behind Luna's ears, feeling a deep gratitude she could never fully express. Thank you, she whispered. Luna wagged her tail as if saying, You were never alone. You just had to believe. Emily's journey was not just about physical recovery. It was about resilience, hope, and the bond between humans and their companions. Life often presents unexpected challenges that leave us feeling lost and broken. But through the unwavering love of those who care, whether family or an unlikely friend, we find the strength to rise again. Emily thought she had lost everything, her identity shattered when she lost the ability to run. Yet in her darkest moments, Luna appeared, not just as a companion, but as a guide, a reminder that she was still whole, still strong. Luna's presence in Emily's recovery highlights that healing isn't always linear. It's not just about medicine or willpower, but connection and quiet understanding. Jack, too, embodied a parent's love, his patience and belief in Emily even when she couldn't believe in herself. His support reminded her that simply being there, refusing to give up, can change everything. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.